The air in Manchuria in August of 1945 was thick with the scent of dust, sorghum, and fear. For years, the Kwantung Army had been the pride of the empire, the guardians of Manchukuo. But the army of 1945 was a hollow shell. Its finest divisions had long been bled white in the Pacific, transferred south to fight the Americans. What remained was a ghost force of aging reservists, raw conscripts, and militia armed with little more than national pride. General Otozo Yamada, commanding from his headquarters in Shinking, knew this. He read the reports, but the reality was far worse than any ink on paper could convey. On August 9th, reality arrived as a red tide of steel. Under the supreme command of Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, 1.5 million Soviet soldiers stormed across 3 fronts. They moved with a speed and ferocity honed over 4 years of brutal warfare against the Germans. In a makeshift field hospital near the city of Harbin, Nurse Akiko Tanaka worked with grim efficiency. The rumble was no longer distant thunder. It was the percussive beat of the world ending. The canvas walls of the tent shuddered with each artillery impact. She ignored the tremor in her hands as she cleaned a wound on a boy who couldn't be older than 16, his uniform ridiculously large for his thin frame. He stared at the tent roof, his eyes wide with a terror that had burned past screaming. The Soviets. They are not like the Chinese, another wounded soldier whispered, his voice raspy. They are demons. They do not take prisoners. Akiko pressed a clean bandage to the boy's shoulder. "Focus on breathing," she commanded, her voice steady, betraying none of the cold dread coiling in her own stomach. "The Emperor's soldiers do not surrender to fear." But the Emperor was far away. Here, there was only the roar of T-34 engines and the chatter of machine guns growing ever closer. The line had not bent. It had shattered. The Kwantung Army was evaporating like a mist in the face of a furnace. Suddenly, the tent flap was ripped open, not by a Japanese orderly, but by 2 massive figures in dusty brown uniforms, their faces smeared with grime and sweat. They held PPSH-41 submachine guns, the circular drum magazines giving them an insect-like, alien appearance. The wounded men who could move scrambled for weapons that weren't there. A sharp, guttural shout in Russian froze everyone. Akiko stood slowly, placing herself between the soldiers and the boy on the cot. She held up her empty hands, the red cross on her armband the only defense she possessed. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat, gun oil, and the foreign, earthy scent of the invaders. One of the soldiers barked a command, gesturing with his weapon towards the outside. The message was clear. Their war was over. A new, more terrifying chapter was just beginning. They were now prisoners. They were herded like livestock. The journey from the ruined hospital was a blur of dust, shouted commands in a language that sounded like cracking stones, and the sight of Japanese resistance collapsing into chaos. Soldiers of the once mighty Kwantung Army, now disarmed and hollow-eyed, joined the shuffling column. So did civilians, colonists, merchants, and their families who had called Manchukuo home for a generation. Among them, Akiko spotted a girl from the nearby settlement, Hana Sato, who had sometimes volunteered at the hospital. Hana's wide, terrified eyes met Akiko's, and a silent pact was formed. Akiko moved through the throng until she was by the girl's side, her presence a small, defiant island of calm in a sea of despair. Their destination was no formal camp. It was a sprawling, hastily cordoned-off railway yard on the outskirts of Harbin. Strands of barbed wire strung between freight cars and rusty poles formed the perimeter. The ground was a cold, unforgiving mix of gravel and mud. There was no shelter from the relentless Manchurian sun, nor the chilling night winds that swept down from Siberia. Food was a ladle of watery millet gruel, served once a day. Water came from a horse trough, swarming with flies. The guards were a mixture of hardened veterans from the European front and younger Siberian troops, their faces impassive, their gazes sweeping over the prisoners with a chilling blend of boredom and contempt. On the third day, a staff car, a captured German Opel, churned through the mud and stopped near the center of the yard. Out stepped an officer. He was different from the guards. His uniform was clean, his boots polished, and a Nagant revolver sat neatly in its leather holster on his hip. He was Captain Dmitry Volkov. His face was sharp, intelligent, and etched with a weariness that did not soften its predatory edge. He had the eyes of a man who had seen everything and was impressed by nothing. He walked along the line of prisoners as they were forced to stand for inspection, his gaze a physical weight. He paused, looking over the defeated soldiers with disdain. Then his eyes settled on the small group of women huddled together for protection. Akiko felt a new kind of cold, one that had nothing to do with the wind. Volkov's gaze slid past her, lingering for a moment before locking onto the youngest, most fragile figure in the group, Hanasato. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. He simply looked at her, a slow, appraising glance that stripped away her dignity layer by layer. He then turned to his hulking sergeant and spoke a few quiet words in Russian. Akiko didn't understand the language, but the sergeant's brief, leering grin was universal. Volkov's eyes flicked back to Hana one last time before he turned and walked back to his car. As the car drove away, one of the few Japanese men in their group who had worked as a translator in Harbin sank to his knees. He was pale, his hands trembling. "What did he say?" Akiko asked, her voice low and urgent. The translator wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the gravel, whispering. He pointed at the girl, at Hana-san. He swallowed hard. "The officer," he said, "that one is mine tonight." A silence deeper than the rumble of artillery fell over their small group. The translator's words hung in the air, a poison that seeped into their bones. Hanasato did not cry. She simply shrank, folding into herself as if to disappear. The other women looked away, their faces a mask of shame and impotent fury. They were prisoners. They were defeated. What could they do? Rage was a useless luxury, Akiko knew. Fear was a poison that would paralyze them. As the sun bled out across the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the railway yard, she felt something else take root in her heart. A cold, hard clarity. She had sworn an oath as a nurse to preserve life, but honor, she realized, was a part of life that could not be surrendered. When the meager evening meal had been distributed and the guards had retreated to the warmth of their fires, Akiko gathered the dozen or so Japanese women into the shadow of a derelict freight car. Their faces were pale in the twilight. "Listen to me," she began, her voice a low, intense whisper that cut through their despair. "You heard the man. You saw the officer's eyes. This will not stop with Hana-san. Tonight, it is her. Tomorrow, it will be another. They see us not as people, but as spoils of war, as things." A sob broke from one of the younger women. "What can we do? We have nothing." "That is where you are wrong," Akiko said. She reached into the folds of her dirt-stained uniform and drew out a small leather roll. Unfurling it on the ground revealed the tools of her trade. Not scalpels or needles, but something simpler. A pair of gleaming steel surgical shears. They were heavy, cold, and brutally functional. The women stared, confused. "What is that for?" asked an older woman, a merchant's wife from Dairen. "They wish to claim a prize," Akiko explained, her gaze meeting each of their eyes in turn. "They want to humiliate us by taking our beauty, our femininity. So we will give them nothing. We will remove the prize ourselves." A gasp went through the group. The meaning was horrifyingly clear. In the Japan they had left, a woman's long dark hair was her glory, a symbol of her identity and grace. To cut it was an act of profound shame, a self-mutilation. "We cannot," the merchant's wife whispered, her hands flying to her own neatly tied bun. "To return home like this. We would be shamed forever." "What home?" Akiko retorted, her voice sharp as glass. "The world we knew is gone. Do you think you will be shamed for this, or for what he intends to do? We will not be victims. We will choose. We will meet their barbarism with a resolve they cannot comprehend." All eyes turned to Hana. The girl was trembling, but she looked up at Akiko, and in her eyes, the terror was being eclipsed by a flicker of something new, a spark of defiance. She slowly, deliberately, knelt on the gravel before Akiko. She took a deep breath, and with a voice that was barely audible but firm as steel, she said, "Please, begin with me." Akiko knelt in front of her. She took the cold shears in her hand. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the boxcars and the distant laughter from the Soviet campfires. Then, the metallic snip-snip of the shears broke the night, sharp and decisive. The first thick black lock of Hana's hair fell silently into the dust. One by one, under Akiko's steady hand, the women were shorn. The heap of lustrous black hair on the ground grew into a dark, sacrificial offering. When the last lock fell, a profound change had settled over them. Their faces, now framed by jagged, boyish crops of hair, looked starker, their jaws more defined. The vulnerability that had clung to them like a shroud was gone, replaced by a severe, communal austerity. They were no longer a collection of individuals. They were a sisterhood, forged in defiance. They huddled together, the cold of the shears now a cold resolve in their veins. Hana, her own transformation complete, sat with a straight back, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond their circle. The sound came minutes later, the crunch of heavy boots on gravel, deliberate, confident. Two figures emerged from the gloom, Captain Volkov and the hulking sergeant. The sergeant carried a lantern which cast a swaying, sickly yellow light, making their shadows leap and dance like ghouls. Volkov did not bother with pleasantries. He strode directly towards the huddle of women, his expression one of bored authority. "Gde ona?" "Where is she?" He grunted to his sergeant, expecting the girl to be produced. The women parted, revealing Hana sitting in their midst. Volkov's eyes fixed on her. And then he stopped, his brow furrowed in confusion. He took a step closer, raising the lantern. The girl looking back at him was not the same one he had seen that afternoon. Her hair was a butchered mess, shorn close to her scalp. Her eyes were not filled with the tears he expected, but with a calm, unblinking stillness. His gaze snapped from her to the woman next to her. The same. And the next. The lantern light swept across the group, revealing the same shocking uniformity. A dozen women, stripped of their most prized feminine feature, staring back at him with an unnerving, collective defiance. His eyes finally fell on the dark, pathetic pile of hair on the ground, and then to the gleaming steel shears in Akiko's hand. Understanding, mingled with disbelief and fury, contorted his features. "What is this? What have you done?" he snarled, his voice a low growl of frustrated rage. He stepped towards Akiko, his hand dropping to the holster of his pistol. Akiko did not flinch. She rose to her feet, a small, gaunt figure against the looming officer. She held the shears up in the lantern light, not as a weapon, but as a statement. Her voice, when she spoke in clear, formal Japanese, was not for him, but for her sisters. "We are not the spoils of your war," she said, her voice ringing with cold conviction in the night air. "We are daughters of Japan. Our honor is not yours to take." Volkov understood nothing of her words, but he understood everything about her tone, her posture, the unwavering look in her eyes. He had faced down Panzerfaust and machine gun nests. He had seen men break in every conceivable way. But he had never seen this. This was not a fight for survival. It was a ritual of self-denial, a form of spiritual resistance so alien to his experience that it completely disarmed him. The prize had been spoiled. The victory he had anticipated was rendered hollow and absurd. To take Hana now would be an act of grotesque pettiness, not conquest. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind. The sergeant stared, his mouth slightly agape. The other Soviet guards who had gathered to watch were silent, their leering anticipation replaced by a stunned confusion. Captain Volkov stared at Akiko, at the shears, at the shorn women. Then, with a curse that was more frustration than threat, he spat on the ground, turned on his heel, and strode back into the darkness. His power had been met and negated, not by force, but by an act that had simply and silently removed the game board. When Captain Volkov was gone, the night seemed to rush back in, colder and quieter than before. No one spoke. The women slowly, almost mechanically, began to gather the shorn hair. It felt like a funeral rite. They wrapped the dark mass in a spare piece of cloth and buried it beneath the gravel, a silent monument to what they had lost and what they had preserved. There was no victory celebration, only a shared, exhausted stillness. They had won a battle, but the war for their survival was far from over. In the days that followed, a strange, new dynamic settled over the camp. The Soviet guards treated the shorn women with a new, grudging distance. The leers and casual cruelties ceased, replaced by a wary, almost superstitious avoidance. They were marked. The other Japanese prisoners, both soldiers and civilians, saw it too. When Akiko walked through the yard to tend to the sick with what little she had, men would nod to her with a respect they had not shown before. In their collective act of defiance, the women had reclaimed a sliver of honor, not just for themselves, but for everyone. They had reminded their captors and their own countrymen that the spirit could not be so easily conquered. Weeks bled into one another. The August heat gave way to the sharp winds of autumn. News filtered into the camp in broken whispers. 2 great flashes of light, the surrender of the emperor, the end of the war. But for them, the end of the war did not mean freedom. It meant a new, uncertain destination. One cold morning, they were marched from the railway yard and packed into cattle cars. The finality of the thick wooden doors sliding shut was absolute. The train lurched forward, its rhythmic clatter a metronome marking their journey into the unknown depths of Siberia. They were being taken to the labor camps, the infamous Gulag system, a fate many would not survive. Packed in the darkness, surrounded by the smell of sweat and fear, Akiko found Hana's hand and held it tight. The girl's hand was cold, but her grip was firm. Through a small crack in the wagon's wall, Akiko could see the vast, empty landscape of Manchuria scrolling past. The land they had once been told was their destiny. From the fictional journal of Akiko Tanaka, presumed written years later, I do not remember the name of the officer. His face is a blur, like so many others, but I remember the sound of the shears. Snip, snip. In that sound, there was no fear. There was choice. They took our country, our homes, our freedom. They took our years, our health, and the lives of many of our friends. But on that night in Harbin, we held on to the one thing they could not claim. In the great, crushing silence of our defeat, we made our voices heard, not with a shout, but with the quiet fall of hair upon the dust. It was the only weapon we had left, and it was enough. We boarded the train for Siberia not as prizes of war, but as women who had refused to be broken. We were still prisoners, but our souls, at least, remained our own.